Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on migrating data from engineering and designer central to the unified product structure, UPS product structure. My name is Mark Young with XLM Solutions. I'm going to turn on my camera real quick so you can see me. And hopefully that's working now, or will be working shortly. So let's get started. So for those of you who do not know us, this is an introductory slide on XLM Solutions. For those of you who know us, you probably heard me go through this slide many times. But basically, XLM is what we consider a complete PLM service and solution provider. We've been in business since 2005, so going on our 20th year now in business. And we provide services on all of the Dassault PLM products, everything from 3DEXPERIENCE, both cloud and on-premise, SolidWorks PDM and managed, their legacy systems like ENOVIA Smart Team or VPM, and then do work with some of their NetVibes and XLE searching solutions. We really, pride ourselves on being highly respected in the PLM industry and the Dassault ecosystem for both our business and technical expertise. We are both a Dassault business partner on the services side and what's considered a SolidWorks certified professional service company. We are always dedicating ourselves not just to helping customers implement the products, but learning ourselves. So always being on the forefront of the latest technologies in the market. We have a whole AI type of research project going on internally, and then also being involved in business trends, best practices from the business side as well. And as today we're going to be talking about migrating from Designer Central to UPS, but we really can do the full gambit of PLM services, everything from discovery workshops to customizations, integrations, data migrations that we're talking about today, and then training and support, and then have a lot of cross industry skills and other IT and high end programming skills. So today, this presentation, I'll be frank, is going to be it's not going to be sexy. There's not going to be a lot of pictures or videos. It's a lot of me talking and looking at PowerPoint bullets. I'd say the topic migrating from engineering to Designer Central is pretty tedious. There's a lot involved, so you're going to be drinking from the fire hose here, and we're really only covering high-end topics. There's a lot of details. Don't expect after this presentation to be able to migrate your Designer Central or Engineering Central to the UPS data model within 3DEXPERIENCE, but hopefully the goal of it is to get you thinking of some of the things you need to think about and prepare for to tackle one of these projects. So with that, let's get started. And I started with really, more thought-provoking questions and comments. And we have a list of them here. And I would say before starting any project from, Designer Central or Engineering Central, I'll just call it Designer Central for short, to UPS, really understand the Dassault UPS data model. Familiarize with it, make sure you understand how it works and behaves. And, one thing is, don't assume there'll always be, what I say, recommended mappings from your current, data models to the UPS one. Dassault has tools that we'll talk about that let you migrate from the CAD, the Designer Central side, to UPS, but there are no tools out there to migrate necessarily non-CAD data, whether that's item data, change information, project information, etc., to UPS. There's ways to do it, but there's no automatic migration tools to do it. So if you need to migrate, other such data, um, definitely that's something to make note of and discover how best to do it. When you're going to do the when assuming you will do the migration, do you plan to migrate or upgrade your existing environment and add kind of the UPS data model to it? Or do you plan to migrate to a new out-of-the-box UPS environment? And as both options are technically valid and probably can have pros and cons for both of them, um, the first one, it's we don't know of anyone doing it, and probably is not the preferred method. There could be various issues that come about it, but technically it's doable. Where the second option is you would stand up an out-of-the-box UPS environment and migrate your data from your current environment into it, and that's kind of more the preferred method. And we suggest doing that way because with a 3D Experience UPS out-of-the-box data model, you get various out-of-the-box roles and behaviors that are set to work with that basically out-of-the-box data model. Where if you were to keep your existing environment or data model, which a lot refer to customer-specific environments, you've customized it. Some of those, Dassault solutions and tools will not work with it. When you're migrating data, do you want to migrate all your data, latest data only, all released and latest in work? So what's the scope of the data that you're going to migrate? When you do that migration, will there be any data transformations? So I always, give the example of going from a numeric revision to an alpha revision, or taking two fields like title 1 and title 2 and combining them into a description field. So do you need to manipulate or transform any of the data going into the new environment? Are you going to migrate your on-premise Designer Central to an on-premise UPS, or do you want to migrate that data to the Dassault public cloud UPS data model? And there's definitely big implications depending on which route you want to go. When you move over to the new data model, do you plan to still use more of the traditional 3D space interfaces or the new 3D dashboards and widgets? Probably one of the reasons to do it is to make use of the new dashboards and widgets, but again, make sure you're familiar with how they work and behave. If you're working with CATIA data, do you want to migrate the CATIA data over as CATIA v5, or do you want to convert it to the new CATIA 3D Experience format, which is very doable in such migrations? And then finally, we left this question last. Maybe it should be first, but when you're doing such migrations, ask, why are you doing the migration in the first place? Are you doing it just to migrate, or really, you have reasons to migrate, i.e., you want to, explore and use new features, behaviors, tools that exist within the UPS data model? So, make sure there's positive reasons for such migrations. For those of you, we talk about the new data model, this UPS data model. For those of you that are not familiar with it, this is a very quick introductory slide to just go over some terms. So one thing I'll talk about is physical products, or I'll use PP for short. But physical products are basically kind of like the item and the CAD document model combined into one type of type. So both your CAD data, your models, and engineering items will both be, basically merged into a physical product. And this is kind of what a physical product graphically is represented in the platform. Here's attributes. Here you can see it, in a BOM type of structure. We also have a type called 3D shape, which basically will store the CAD file within it. And you can see here, we have the physical product, and as a child of it, there's the 3D shape object, which has the CAD file. Here's kind of another representation of it. We have collaborative spaces. You may be using collaborative spaces already, but collaborative spaces, is a way to group or control security around files in the platform. And here's a way to, kind of visualize a collaborative space and users and security around it. And there's many other types behind the scenes and even in the forefront, but these are the key types we'll be kind of dealing with today. So data mapping, let's start with CAD. So your CAD models, regardless of the CAD type, will be mapped to these physical products and 3D shapes within 3DEXPERIENCE. And I'm using the term physical product. Behind the scenes in the data model, you'll also see the term VPLM reference, and you'll also see engineering item. They're all pretty much one and the same, just different names for the same thing, almost an external name and an internal name. CAD drawings will be mapped to a UPS drawing type, so it will have its own type. When you're doing mappings, you need to map, the variables, what metadata you have on your Designer Central CAD data to the various UPS, types. And, there will be out-of-the-box attributes that come out of the box, and then you can create your own custom attributes as needed. Though sometimes if you have subtypes within your Designer Central data model, so you have different types that represent same CAD object. This may be more with items. You may want to consider classification, the classification manager tool, to allow different attributes based on different classes or organizational structure of the data. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Also, when you're doing your data mapping exercise, you want to understand if you have any special rules in place of how you deal, add, manipulate metadata. So we've seen customers where they have various rules in place that only certain users and certain groups can manipulate or update certain metadata fields at certain times. So you don't really have that control out of the box in UPS. And if you have rules or customizations in place that do that, we really need to do a more detailed assessment of how we can handle that. Maybe it would be a change to a business process or another way to deal with it. Revisions. So if you are, again, you need to map your revision sequence that you're using today to a revision sequence in 3DEXPERIENCE. You can have custom 3DEXPERIENCE or custom revision sequences today in 3DEXPERIENCE. So in theory, most revision sequences will be supported, but it does not today, and I heard this functionality may be coming, it does not today support numeric and then alpha revision schemes, i.e. going from like a prototype revision scheme to a production revision scheme. So if you have that situation, you may need to change your process or use some customization to support it, which can be supported, in the UPS data model. Also, you want to understand if you're using minor revisions today. So if you're using minor revisions today, minor revisions are handled differently within the UPS data model. So again, understand how your minor revisions are working and how primary and secondary is what they're called, are handled in the UPS data model because they're handled differently. And if you do need to support a primary and secondary revision, make sure you configure 3DEXPERIENCE to support that revision policy moving forward. You want to understand how your derived outputs or your viewable files are being managed in your current Designer Central today. Are they managed as what we say derived outputs, which are kind of associated to the CAD data? Or are they managed as separate objects that you link to the CAD object? So that would impact how that data gets loaded into the system. And based on that, do you need to load them? Can you ignore them, skip them, etc.? Or and based on how your viewables or your drive file formats are managed will affect how to map that data over. And then we'll talk about issues, but this is a very common issue, and there's not a right answer to it. I'll tell you right now, but something to think about. You may have two CAD objects that represent the same part. So a part designed in SolidWorks and a part designed in CATIA. Are you going to map them both over as separate objects? Are you going to map them over as one object, and then which CAD file wins? Are they going to have the same part number, different part numbers? So this is a topic that should be investigated and addressed. Mainly dealing if you have one or more or two or more CAD systems being integrated into 3DEXPERIENCE. Data mapping from items. So items will also be migrated to physical products. And if I didn't say this, I'll say this now. UPS stands for Unified Product Structure. So there's no more two trees, let's say a CAD tree and an item tree moving forward in UPS. It's one common tree. And in theory, your CAD structure represents your bill of materials, but you can add non-CAD items to that bill of materials, or you could have two different CAD structures from two different CAD systems put together into a tree where, at a very high level, you might design the chassis in CATIA, but the engine is designed in SolidWorks. So you're going from two trees to one tree. And that's kind of my point. In UPS, there's no distinct object separating the CAD model from the engineering item. It's one single item. So if you have Designer Central and Engineering Central, there's various relationships that could come apart. And where things need to be thought out of is if you have more than one CAD model associated to an item, kind of like that last point from the CAD mapping slide, or we have multiple items associated to one CAD model. And in both cases, those scenarios need to be thought out of. If there's a one-to-one relationship between CAD and item, basically, the plan would be to merge the attributes together from both, objects in Engineering Central and Item Central into one physical product object. And depending on those merge rules, you can again use classification to manage whether it's item-specific attributes or CAD-specific attributes or purely classification type of data. If there are multiple CAD models associated with a single item, then definitely further discussion needs to happen to figure out what's the best approach to handle it. And if you have items standalone, not linked to any CAD, again, that's pretty straightforward. They would just migrate over as physical products as well. When dealing with items, we always want to talk about phase and EC parts versus design parts. And a lot of customers, they're again using a development and a production phase or even different data types. So again, UPS doesn't have the equivalent for these concepts. And if you're using them, then we should discuss alternatives, such as maybe putting development parts in one collaborative space and production parts in another collaborative space, having a phase attribute, or other mechanisms to represent the development per versus production states. And then again, the same type of rules for revision mappings, that I mentioned on the CAD slide apply for item mappings as well. Collaborative spaces. Excuse me for a second. So in Designer Central and Engineering Experience, Item Central, you have kind of what's considered a workspace vault structure, which can be mapped to your local disk drive. That does not exist in UPS. In UPS, though, you still have bookmarks and folders, but again, that structure is not synced to the local drive like Designer Central. So if you're doing stuff off local drives that mimic your workspace vault or your bookmark structure, that doesn't exist in UPS. Again, collaborative spaces, and you may already be using this, though, is where security is applied. It's a combination of your user, organization, and role. This is the whole Dassault, P&O, people and organizational structure. So again, get very familiar with how that works. But the key thing is, if you're on that customer specific environment, those roles don't necessarily, if you create custom roles, those roles don't necessarily map over to out of the box roles, or you need to do your best method to map them over to out of the box roles. So again, discussions and work may be needed to be done here to figure out your security model in the UPS environment. And then, when you are setting up the security model in the UPS environment, best practices, we always say aim for a simplified security setup where possible. Try to minimize your collaborative spaces and organizations to, again, keep it simple. And if you need, more complex security rules, again, that's something to discuss and investigate. But there is a module from the so-called, IP security, intellectual property security, that could be leveraged to perform some of those more advanced security rules. Process mapping. Again, I think we saved it for last, but also is extremely critical and one of the more important topics. I always tell people it's easy to migrate the data over. The hard part is understanding how users will use the new environment and the new behavior. So it's very important, and this can be done through workshops, but really map and validate how users are going to work in the new UPS environment. And here's some things that you really should think about and validate. But simply how users will search and access data. Depending on what version of 3D Experience you're on, older versions were using more what was considered like a database or an attribute search, while newer versions use more of the XLead or Google type searching. So make sure that process is in place. How will users create new data? What are the processes of them for creating a CAD data, creating a model, a drawing, an item, etc. How will users make changes to data, whether it be CAD changes, metadata changes, product structure changes, etc. And how will those changes affect data in different states? What will be your process to release or make changes in the system? Are you going to be using, change requests, change orders, and change actions? And, if you move to UPS, there's these new widgets out there that support all that stuff. But, do you want to go the widget route or still use the old 3D space route? You know, it probably makes sense to, use the new widgets, but again, validate how they work and how they behave and they meet your requirements. Do you have any ERP or an external system integrations out there? If so, those integrations will need to be rewritten. And, again, that, should be planned into your overall process. And then, what else are you doing within 3D Experience? What other processes you have? Make sure you can, do similar processes within the new data model. And, hopefully, all of that will be a simple transformation, but don't take it for granted and validate it. Data cleaning. So, I never do a data migration presentation without having at least one data cleaning slide. No matter how clean you say your data is, usually there's some data cleaning that needs to happen. So definitely you want to do some checks and validation on your data. Make sure your references or your instances, whether they be configurations or whatnot, are valid, have proper names. There are issues if you try to migrate data and you have a space before the extension. So you could have file washer1 space dot cat part. That will not fail, and believe it or not, we've seen a lot of data like that. So you need to clean up such files if that exists. If you have missing or broken references, they can cause issues with migrating that data over. If you have invalid revisions, so you have revisions on data that don't support the revision scheme you set up in the new UPS model, again, that could cause issues. So, there's various reports and checks to validate data. And then when dealing with data, it's not just dealing with the parts assemblies or products and drawings. You also got to understand what other, and in this case, CATIA or SolidWorks modules or functions are you using? Are you using any electrical or electrified data, manufacturing data, piping, catalogs, materials, etc. All those I'd say are special cases that you want to validate are clean and good, because we've seen where users can cause mismatch issues, but also that your migration tools can handle them. And the same goes for various types within SolidWorks, whether it's routings, materials, toolbox parts, virtual components, etc. So migration technology, with any migration, I usually try to split it between an export side and an import side. So getting the data out of the designer central engineering central environment, and then the second side is putting it into the UPS data model. So to get the data out, there's various technologies out there to do that. And you want to get it out in a format where you can use that format to get it into the UPS data model. So there's XML format, which I'd say a subset of that is what's considered these XPDM XML files that deal with the Dassault EDAT tool. We'll talk about that later. JSON is like a lighter weight of XML. Comma separated is very old, probably not as functional format, but can be used in some cases. And then StepX is like a step file format that doesn't necessarily contain geometry, but contains metadata structure information that can be used to import data into the UPS data model. And then there's many tools out there to get the data out. There's MQL, there's web services, direct database queries. You can write your own program, Java programs. And then in bold here, I have the Dassault EDAT tool. EDAT stands for ENOVIA, I believe, ENOVIA Development Accelerator Tool or technology. And this is a tool by Dassault that is built to augment or accelerate migrations from Designer Central to the UPS data model. Talking about that tool, so EDAT tool, it makes use of these XPDM XML files to export and import file. This tool, though, is only supported for on-premise environments. So if you're going from Designer Central on-premise to UPS on-premise, then this would be a tool that can be used. Again, it makes use of these XPDM XML files that you see here, and then makes use of the CATIA import, XPDM import and export batches to get the data into 3DEXPERIENCE. And really, this tool is the only supported tool for loading CAD data to on-premise environments. If you're going to on cloud, you can make use of the EIF import tool. So that's a tool that uses the EIF Enterprise Integration Framework technology to load data and CAD data to on-cloud environments. And I just learned, well, I'll get to the next slide here. There is also will be, and I'll explain myself just in a second, there will also be a migration assistant tool to migrate data from Designer Central to on-cloud environments as well. Now, in the past, this migration assistance tool, which makes use of the EIF technology up above, was only geared to migrate SolidWorks PDM and Smart Team environments to 3DEXPERIENCE UPS on cloud. And I just learned that this tool will be expanded to migrate Designer Central to 3DEXPERIENCE on cloud as well, but that part of it has not been released yet and doesn't have a release date. In addition to these out-of-the-box tools, you can also use various other technologies to load data. Again, MQL, web services, direct SQL inserts, custom programs, etc. And in many cases, it's a combination of these tools that are used to load the data into 3DEXPERIENCE. In addition to the tools, you need to orchestrate the migration process. So many customers have, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of records, and you can't just, have a simple program that one by one, exports, imports. You really need a method to kind of orchestrate and handle the process as a whole. So you need an orchestration layer to handle your, and I'm using the term batch exports and imports. So you want to be able to have this orchestration, be able to track and display your migration status, handles errors, if there's failures, be able to retry a batch or redo a batch, provide comprehensive logging. It's never going to go perfect. There's going to be issues, and you need to look at what went wrong, look at logs, analyze it, fix data, and redo it. You need to enforce proper loading order. So you need to make sure you load your child parts before you load your products or assemblies that are dependent on those childs, and you load your grandparent assemblies before they are, or after after the sub-assemblies are loaded. So you really need to enforce your loading order to make sure data is loaded in the proper order. And again, when we're dealing with high volumes of data, you need to support parallel processing. You can't just have a single threaded machine loading data. You want to be able to spin up multiple machines that can parallelly load data, at once. And doing exports in parallel to doing imports. And there's various ways that such an orchestration level can be developed. Going back to EDAT, they have a built-in solution making use of an active MQ technology, which is a queuing type of technology, but there's different ways to handle it. All right, talking about EDAT a little bit in more detail. This is my one graphical slide here. But in this case, you have your Designer Central, UPS, and then you have your migration or your EDAT environment. And this whole thing, ActiveMQ again here is the orchestration. But in how this works is it's analyzing data and building that data loading order, and making sure the data is validated to load. It's extracting data to load, and then it's importing the data to load. So these are various operations that are happening. Here's kind of visual pictures of each operation. So here, analyze is happening and analyzing the data and building various reports. Here's export is happening and exporting data and keeping track of what exported successfully, what failed. And in parallel to data being exported, we can start importing. And again, this is like an active MQ picture. It's keeping track and moving stuff from export queues to import queues and keeping track of what succeeded and failed as well. So this is a one slide, which could be a whole presentation of how EDAT is being used to migrate data over to UPS. Other points to consider. Again, you want the ability to pre and post process data. So going back here, data is being extracted, but maybe you need an intermediate step here to pre-process the data and massage the data before it gets imported. Maybe you need to change the revision or check for some valid conditions. And you want to post-process the data. So after it gets imported, maybe you need to run additional tools to augment or manipulate the data as necessary for your migration requirements. So you want to be able to pre and post process data. Maybe that's cleaning data. Maybe it's creating those derived viewable files. Through some of the out-of-the-box tools, it's supported for creating those derived outputs for CATIA and SolidWorks, but if you have other CAD systems like Creo or Solid Edge, you may need to run external tools to build those derived output viewable files. I talked about classification and bookmarks a little bit. If you want to apply data to a classification structure or a bookmark structure, you would need to post-process the data to handle those links within the system. And then there could be other possible, enrichments of the data that you need to do. The other thing is your environments, which, sometimes are forgotten. But as I said, you're never going to load the data once or the first time and it be all correct. So you need an ability to, be able to load data into an environment, find issues, make fixes, and then restore that environment to a clean state to reload the data. And if you're on premise or on cloud, there's different ways to do it. And again, they both have their pros and cons. Also, through any migration project, usually configuration of the system is going on in parallel. You may not have the final data model or configuration set yet when you start that migration. So usually there'll be another environment that's being used to help configure and validate the system. So any configurations you do will need to be pushed to your migration environments as well. And keeping all these environments in sync is key. Again, that could be another whole presentation on DevOps and whatnot on how to best keep your various environments in sync to make the migration process or any implementation process as efficient as possible. Testing and validation. Anyone who is going to migrate from Designer Central and Engineering Central to UPS should have a comprehensive test plan in place. Don't just say, yeah, we'll get some users to test. Make sure you have a test plan in place and you follow it. So, have that plan, make sure key users are testing it, test different security scenarios in the plan, making sure the P&O that you've set up is working as discussed. Test how, users will perform different activities, test on small sets of data, test on large sets of data. Is performance adequate? Is there, issues, between different data sets? Test how data, do tests on migrated data and newly created data. So not just test the data you created that was migrated, but create new data and then use that new data and migrated data and make sure everything works. If you have standards or standard parts in the system, make sure those standard parts work. Those standard parts work with migrated data, etc. Don't just deal with design data. Expect there'll be issues and make sure, apply time to resolve them. Usually I say, you'll have 2 or 3 test migration cycles before you do a full migration run. Perform load testing, again, making sure the system performs adequately with the migrated data. If you have issues with migrated data, validate, is it a migration issue or a configuration issue? So try to reproduce the same issue with newly created data and see if it's just related to the migrated data or not. And yeah, make sure you use the new migrated data with the new features and processes and behaviors in the UPS data model to make sure they're, functioning as expected. But I can't stress enough how important testing and validation is. With all that being said, you pass all your testing and validation. I'd say with proper planning, the final migration should go smoothly. Document all the steps. There's going to be various steps involved in the migration process. Make sure to document and follow those procedures. Though with Murphy's Law, allocate additional time for unexpected issues and be prepared to support users in the new environment. I'm talking about migrations, but there's a whole subject of training and making sure the users are enabled to work in the new environment. And there will be a learning curve there, so make sure you have proper processes and people in place to support them. And then finally, in conclusion, I would say with proper planning and testing, migrating from Designer Central and Item Central to UPS can go smoothly. Though, you want to select the best migration tools for your needs. You want to validate all your processes and set up the right mappings. But then you want to, follow again to repeat your documented procedures, have the buffer time, and be able to support the users of the new system. And again, there isn't a presentation where I don't say this, but the devil's in the details. You really need to understand, your requirements, the data sets, limitations, technologies involved to do it, and set realistic, expectations. It's going to be a different system. You may not have 100% data transfer, but we should get it to a point where it's not going to affect or have an impact, moving forward in any manner. And finally, I'd say almost anything is possible. There really hasn't been a data migration scenario that can't be accomplished in a straight manner approach, to handle it. But with that, I'm going to say thank you. Open it up to questions. I see a couple questions here already. So, one question was, what is the solution for different revision schemes for dev and prod parts? My understanding is there may be a solution coming from Dassault, but in the meantime, we've developed a custom widget that allow customers, move from numeric revisions to alpha revisions. So I would say the current solution today would be a customization. In our case, we have a custom widget that allows customers to do that. Another question, can this slide presentation be shared? Yes, please reach out to me if you want it. Also, the recording of this will be made available, and anyone should be able to access the recording of this for future reference as well. Another question, is it possible to migrate old revisions with large quantities? So I'm not sure exactly what that's meant, but I would say yes. Whether you have an old revision scheme and you want to migrate it over into the platform, yes, that should be possible. Now, I don't know if you want to use that old revision scheme going forward or not. That would be something to discuss. Or if you're saying you have large quantities of objects using an old revision or revisions, then yes, you can do that as well through the various tools I explained. Someone asked, how long should one of these migrations take? Depending on how much data you have and your mapping processes, they can be complex. I would say on the short side, 2 to 3 months. On the long side, 6+ months. I wouldn't say anything probably, close. It could be close to a year. So, that's where setting expectations come into play. It's not going to be an overnight thing. These things take time to set up, configure, test, validate, prepare the users, and do that production run. As a year of calendar time, it's not a year of billable time. The amount of time professional services involved is less, but it's still a project. There is probably a good price tag behind it as well. There's a question mentioning documents. It said I didn't really talk about document migrations. So if you have plain old documents in the system, I need to check if the EDAT tool handles that or not. But again, we've developed a custom tool that can read exported data, whether it be XML or a CS file from Excel, and then load that data with metadata into the platform as well. And that tool we have also does classifications as well, if that's needed, sort of as a post-processing that I mentioned. That looks like all the questions for now. As I mentioned, feel free to reach out to me if you want this presentation or you have any more questions. We would love your feedback on the webinar if you found it useful or not, or other topics for other webinars. We're here to please our audience with hot topics you're interested in. But once again, thank you, and I'm happy to approach anyone individually for any individual questions or discussions on this topic. I'll stay here for another minute, and then in case any other questions come in, and then I will end the webinar.